Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout 1 for Emergency Management Integration 1 online course. First of all, I wanted to apologize that I get that feedback to you quite late. I tried to do those within a week to 2 weeks. Yours was very long, and I had some health issues along the way, so my bad, and that's why I postponed your other Hangout till next week. Now, that said, I noticed that there has been several attempts by Justin and your group to communicate for the first Hangout, and you were not successful to integrate him into your group. So I'm not really sure what happened. He didn't speak to me, but you need to make sure that he doesn't lose points by being excluded, and that the one that's going to be assigned next week, that you coordinate with him and make sure that you are able all to tune in at the same time. If need be, exchange phone numbers, try to get in touch with one another. So I don't want him to lose the learning opportunity, and also you are a team, and I really can't put him in with any other group because you are the group and you are the cohort for the class. So so try to work with Justin Leggett on having him in the next one. Just overall, another part that I do take attention to those Hangouts, and I do listen to everything you have to say, and I'm pretty diligent with note taking. So yours was very long. It was actually double the time that typically 3 people would engage in a Hangout, which is not bad. I'm not saying that. You are just you have different group dynamics. You think through issues. You speak about them slower, and so and you also were very comprehensive, and you covered all the points. So this is not a criticism. It's just that it was a very long session, and I have listened to everything you had to say. Lena, I just wanted to tell you that you ran it very well. You set it up first time out of the gate, so kudos on that, and thank you for being the first one. The first one's always the worst, and so I do thank you for that. And I noticed that at the beginning you had some technical difficulties because you had a mic coming through with a voiceover and stuff like that, and you caught on that and you eliminated it within the first 10 or 15 minutes of the transmission. So that's very good. That's a very nice facilitating. And you also participated in a discussion in addition to being a facilitator. So again, very well done. General comment on your discussion is that you were very comprehensive, and you really build up on one another knowledge. It sort of came in pieces. You didn't have all the answers from the get-go, but by the time you were done discussing a particular question, among all 3 of you, you pretty much covered the topic. And I do appreciate that you did have the books and you referred back to the Rubin textbook during your presentation as well. So whenever there was something that required more of a policy or a year, or, it's hard to remember all those statutes and policies, you were able to go back and sort of fish it out and know where it is, which, gives me a comfort that you are reading through the book. Rubin book is not the easiest because it's very, very heavily policy and detail. So I'm glad that you use that as a reference. So let me go over and give you some of my general observations on those on the questions that you addressed. So the first question was the difference between civil defense and civil protection, and I think you sort of circled around on this one for a while before you sort of zoom in on it. And you definitely came to define it towards the end of the class when you were your discussion when you were talking about the all hazards approach. But definitely, as as we look at the evolution of federal assistance to people affected by any type of disasters. We're looking at civil defense being the actions taken for the actions of war. So generally, associated with the role of military. So Department of Defense. And you did talk about it eventually. I think, Lena, you mentioned that it was sort of the national versus domestic, and that the civil defense had to do with nuclear attacks. Certainly during the Cold War era, that was a predominant threat. And the thing I think the most important to remember is that the national defense is truly from the enemies from the outside. So it does have to do with protecting the populations, and the state responsibility of a nation's responsibility, government responsibility, to protect people from the enemy, from intentional conflict. That puts a burden of responsibility on the federal government, because federal government is responsible for the nation's safety. Whereas the civil protection, which has more to do with the emergencies and natural disasters historically, remember, was not that much a burden on the federal government, because you could say those are the acts of God, and the federal government doesn't really have that much responsibility for those. So there was a very clear distinction in early years when we speak of managing emergencies and resulting disasters. There was this clear divide about what is the responsibility of the federal government, and that defense and protection in a way sort of did not go hand in hand. Defense is on the president, on the Department of Defense, on all those federal entities. Protection is more, the responsibility of the state. Protection is more about people, taking care of themselves at the local level, for those, being able to prepare and stuff like that. So it's not that much of the federal government in early years. And that's where this distinction comes in, or is important. Why is it important? Because we truly had the enemy during the Cold War, and that enemy was Russia and the entire Soviet bloc that was connected to this. So we were living in a sort of era of where we were afraid that there's going to be an external attack, and so all the funding and all the money and all the preparedness went into those bomb shelters, nuclear shelters, and so on, dealing with possible nuclear fallout and stuff. But it was a very high consequence threat, but didn't materialize, fortunately. Michela mentioned Quarantelli. Thank you for that. Henry Quarantelli is a guru of emergency management, the founder of many current theories in emergency management, and he makes that distinction between crisis and consensus events. So the crises are the ones that are intentional, that are caused by someone. It's early classification. It's kind of old today. You had a good discussion about, all different types of threats and hazards, but that was Quarantelli's classification. Definitely different activities are required in the times of peace than in the times of war. And in the times of war, definitely we are dealing with civil defense. And so, if we have a war where there is a biological weapon that is, deployed, then, people will have gas masks and stuff like that, or, those type of things. They were already happening in 1918 during the flu, during the pandemic, as you read, and I remind you about the Cockrell article on very early coordination by the health departments with the civil defense forces that were there. Civil defense forces were in charge of propaganda for the war, and they existed at the local level, but they were federal entities. So you can say that even as early as 1918, we had that strong element of civil defense, not as much of, civil protection. Todd elaborated on that more, talked about the war, and you brought out that war and sort of that's that teasing out, and the home front unit and Israeli Defense Forces you brought into the discussion. I thought that was a really good catch. And then when you talked about the involvement of military in natural disasters, you sort of started with talking about the engagement of military during the earthquake in Kobe. And sort of later on, you started getting more into the policy and regulations and laws. which, I'll discuss, with respect to the National Guard. So civil protection, again, you focused on disaster preparedness and emergency preparedness, more starting with the local level, focusing on fire, police, volunteers, including non-governmental organizations, dealing with the community at the individual level. And so with that, you sort of covered the difference. The difference is, one is sort of the responsibility of the federal government because it is security issue, right? The other one falls more on localities because it's those acts that are more natural, that happen, that affect communities, and they are not for the federal government to get involved quite as much. So that's that protection and civil protection and civil defense that sort of did not go hand in hand until they started sort of merging and seeing one another in the 50s and then 60s, when we started realizing that all those money that we're spending on all those shelters and all those alarms and warnings about the nuclear war, they were not really being utilized for that. And yet, in the meantime, we had all those natural events that sort of required very similar money or functions be activated. And we sort of needed that more from the Fed because the local communities where, those events started getting more and more complex. When we had that discussion of civil protection and civil defense, I wanted you to also think about a difference between safety and security. I don't know if we've had that discussion before, but clearly when we think about hazards, we're thinking about safety. Hazards are things that have to do with an inherent danger of a certain element. It's not truly intentional. It's not caused by anybody, right? When you say safety belt or safety exits, or like on the airplane, you don't call it a security exit, you don't call it a security belt, right? Because you are protecting yourself from something more naturally occurring or something that could happen that's incidental. When you're dealing with security, that's always that element of intentionality that somebody means. So the security deals with threats, and safety deals sort of with hazards. So when you think about that this way, then you are thinking about when it went to safety, it was different, it was local, it was, not a responsibility of the federal government. When you talk security, that's a predominant function of the government. Why does the government exist? To make sure that the homeland is secure. And so the security of threat, on the other hand, hazard and some natural occurrence. And so this was a sort of thinking at a time, and those two were rather separate. And as you know from early years of looking at disasters, that federal aid was very minimal, and the states had to rely on themselves. So then you sort of moved to looking at the National Guard, and you had a sort of really interesting conversation about that, what it does and when it does what. I think Todd brought about the NOLA, New Orleans evacs, and having students post-Katrina at his university, and talked about the public university and the National Guard being stationed there to sort of keep an oversight of those operations. And I think there is perhaps a certain confusion, because you had then a discussion on, I think Lena was talking about that because it was a federally declared disaster, maybe this was the federal response, and so on and so forth. So I think it's really important to remember that the thing about National Guard, just like with National Defense, National Guard is military under Title 10. And you were sort of going back, Mikhail, I think, brought out the title discussion, which was very good from Alexander, and you sort of follow up. There's two titles, Title 10 and 32. So under 10, they're military. So National Guard, as a military, acts with President as Commander-in-Chief. So it's under the governance of a president of the United States, which means National Guard can be deployed to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to, all those different wars that we are fighting if necessary, if forces need to be augmented, right? But as military, and this is where that Posse Comitatus Act comes to bear, which is very important. As a military, National Guard cannot perform law enforcement, safety and security functions within local communities in the United States because it is not allowed. Military cannot do curfew. Military cannot handcuff people. Military cannot arrest people in the United States. It is prohibited by law. So if a National Guard on any given day is, when they train, when they practice, and Todd, you were right, their activities or their functions, when they are just Title 10, they are part of the military. They're part of reserves, so to speak. They can have educational outreach. You talked about assessments at the ports and all that. Yes, that's all. As part of the military, they do a lot of different functions, but they are still the military. So with any security issues with population, they're not allowed to get involved. And so this was a very big issue in Katrina because the state governor of Louisiana, Blanco, at a time, did not properly utilize the National Guard when she could have, because there was the understanding, at least a false understanding, that they have a federal resource, therefore they are military, therefore they cannot be used, with those populations, to instill curfew and stuff like that. All those, supposed actions of looting and what have you, the sort of disintegration of control in Katrina. So here is where the Title 32 comes in. The National Guard is a resource for the governor of a state. And you finally teased it out that it could be used, by the President of the United States as part of the military. And this is generally what they do. They get deployed, they train, all that they do as part of the Department of Defense. But then, if situation requires, they can be auxiliary to the governor and to the state, and they are becoming a state resource. Their function changes. They are now under Title 32. Under Title 32, they're just like any other law enforcement in that state. So they have the same function as DPS or a police officer. They are becoming a peace officer of that state. So now they can cuff, they can institute curfew, they can do all this law enforcement because they are no longer, for that period of time when they are needed by the governor, they are no longer military. So this is very important because, when you think about like Rick Perry, deployed 2,000 or 3,000 troops to the border, that was not under federal government, obviously. That was during the President Obama administration where, this National Guard that was deployed to Texas border was not working for President Obama. That National Guard got activated for the governor, Rick Perry, who did his assessment of the border and said, I need that presence of additional security at the border. And that additional security is not military. They are actually my law enforcement, so to speak. They have all those, they are not bound by the Posse Comitatus. So this is this fundamental difference that we know that the National Guard is not seen as military, is seen as a regular state law enforcement auxiliary, obviously more militarized, more securitized, with more equipment, with more resources, and so on and so forth. So going back to Todd and going back to Lena, when the deployment of National Guard to the university might have nothing to do with the fact that it was a federally declared disaster, but more so by the state governor that decided that they will activate that National Guard to support all other law enforcement entities with different functions. So what they do, what the typical tasks with civil defense would be, is preparing for war and war activity. So, all the training that is going to prep them for combat. But they also have this very huge civil protection mission when the tables are reversed and they're under Title 32. It's not like that with the rest of the military. There are some parts of the military, they are called civil support task forces. They are housed in Virginia, and they can be deployed, and they are it's a federal resource that also the status gets changed to be able to assist as a civilian support. But again, generally, historically, the United States did not want military to be engaged with the public with things like arrests and curfews and stuff like that, because they were afraid of, potential abuses of federal power over state and local jurisdictions, and militia issues and stuff like that. So this is sort of where the discussion was relevant, is to know that the National Guard can be either or, and it will be the prioritizing by the governor and really not good knowledge of the resources by the governor, which didn't happen in Katrina. And I think that's why we're having those discussions, so we know very well if the National Guard is called up here domestically, they're gonna be most likely under Title 32. And they are working then not as predominantly for defense as a military, but as a state resource. So, and I think it was Lena that brought up, or maybe Michaela might have brought up the Posse Comitatus, or Lena, and that Posse Comitatus Act is from 1878. So it's a very, very strong and well-established law, and not much is going to change in that law, with regards to military. And I think that, so you took out of that, from that Posse Comitatus, that truly under the Title 10, it would be a Secretary of Defense and the President ultimately that is in charge of National Guard. And then under Title 32, it's going to be the governor of the state. And of course, they have then more of as a resource for the governor, they have rescue missions, but they can be law enforcement as well. They can, it will depend on the governor and on the type of event. Obviously, with a natural disaster, activating National Guard is not a big issue because they are there with their humanitarian relief. But if you have things like public unrest or riots and stuff, then those decisions are a lot more difficult, because when people watch on TV and they see National Guard being used by the state, they are thinking automatically about military, and and sort of the red lights go on that this is the federal intervention. It is not. Generally, when you have issues with public unrest in a particular locality, the governor can assess and say, I'm activating National Guard as an additional layer of security for the state. They are not military, but because they are dressed like military and because their equipment is very security-like, people tend to think that we are going into war when we activate National Guard, but it's not necessarily so, except with a threat. When you are afraid during riots, you're afraid of intentional acts. It's a little bit different. People see it differently, and the public perception of them is different than when they are working on a relief and side of things. Although, of course, they can work as protection, prohibiting entrances to residences, making sure that they restore law and order, even in those jurisdictions that are under the emergency conditions from natural disasters. So I thought that discussion was very good, because you sort of moved slowly and you processed those issues, and you sort of, from from the thread to the big picture, you actually brought it all together with, the differences in titles and the Posse Comitatus Act and the defense versus protection sort of missions that are not always complementary, because, one is more military-like, one is more like home-like, and more associated with our police officers and with really delivering a service to citizens, right? Police is not the same as soldiers. So, very interesting. Todd, I think you mentioned about port security operations and vulnerability assessments, and also when they do come, when the National Guard comes, they do have a lot of resources because they are certainly have expertise because they train for war. They are part of DoD, so they do have more of its security aspect awareness. So then you sort of moved into discuss the Federal Disaster Relief Act of 1950, and I thought the discussion sort of followed very similar as on your first question. You sort of started saying, I think Elena talked about temporary housing in Harvey or flood insurance, sort of big picture, why it was important because of the things we're doing today, that people are not reluctant to evacuate because they know that there's going to be some subsidized housing for them from the federal government. And so they are more likely to heed warning signs. Not all of them do, but some, maybe that improved over the years. Michaela talked about both acts, about the Federal Disaster Relief Act and the Defense Act, and sort of saying, they were kind of going hand in hand, and they were issued at the same time, sort of as if to institutionalize that federal assistance on both angles, so that was really interesting. And I think your discussion with the Federal Disaster Relief Act, Michaela, you were saying again that it was more about pushing that preparedness to the local level and so on and so forth. And I think then Todd came in and sort of tied it all together, talking about how really the critical piece of that 1950 Disaster Relief Act was that it allowed one person to make those decisions in disaster, presidential declarations. It brought those presidential declarations in where before you had to have Congress deliberate and assess and wonder, how much are we going to give them and what is the state of affairs? Well, this entire congressional oversight got eliminated. So that was number one, that Congress got sort of removed from this. They establish a budget, you have an act, you establish a budget, and then you don't have to go to Congress every time you have this big disaster that needs relief in a particular locality. Number two was that, of course, there was these, with the federal relief, there came a sort of a more oversight on states being now responsible for planning for emergencies. Because if the federal government doesn't have, doesn't pay, the federal government doesn't require, right? If the federal government doesn't pay for anything, they cannot tell the governor to spend money for plans and preparedness. But when the federal government suddenly starts having strings attached, we're going to give temporary housing, we're going to do, subsidize the areas for flooding and stuff like that. But you, the governor, you are now responsible for having this, and this in place. And so this is a sort of more of a federal control that started a lot more than before 1950, right? Where it was more kind of like if the presidents liked it or if the Congress voted for it. So this is a sort of a first step into institutionalizing that federal aid. And also, for the very first time, you are looking at the temporary and basic need relief So not just response, but we are moving a little bit more towards a short-term recovery. So if you're thinking about a cycle of emergency management, planning preparedness, the response phase, the federal government had some responses, right, in all those focusing events. But now they're sort of moving, we're going to help a little bit with, okay, you know, giving this for housing, giving this for this type of a relief, giving this for this type of a relief. Now we are moving more towards a short-term recovery, so to speak. They're getting, federal government is a little bit more involved on that end. So, and of course, I think Todd mentioned that what it created also is created equity. So now all the states equally, regardless whether they have a very, you know, politically influential governor who maybe is in good terms with the president, or, you know, some localities or rural areas that don't have political clout. Now when the Congress deliberates, they don't have to listen to all the lobbyists and stuff like that. I mean, you know, every state has an equal opportunity to apply for that standardized federal aid through, you know, through standardization of those processes, for actually having a law, an act that's now a law. So this is, those are those really significant points that happened in the 50s. Now, that was a beginning. What we have today, obviously, is a 70 years later, right? The act has gotten changed and expanded many times, as you've read. But in 1950, it was a fundamental shift in the way federal government looks at emergency management, at relief to any type of disasters, and particularly those natural ones, not just, you know, the enemy ones from intentional actors. That it has to take more control, more responsibility, and also help the states more accountable. Because if you give the states the money, you can also hold them more accountable. So, so again, you had a good discussion. Some of that information was in Rubin on pages 86 and 87, and Todd, you know, Todd actually, you know, went through the points that they were making there on those, you know, major contributions. The major contribution was now the president can declare and make all those declarations of disaster that you subsequently discussed in your discussion board the following week. Now, question number 5 had to do with 2 events, the Alaska quake and Betsy, both in the 60s, so 64, 65, sort of, you know, a decade and a half after the act was passed. And I think you had the really good discussion there on the expansion of federal aid provisions, and you did talk about the forgiveness of loans. That was specifically, I think when you look at the Alaska earthquake, the important thing to remember there was that now we are moving even further than response and maybe short-term recovery. Now we are talking about reconstruction. When you hear that, reconstruction sounds very much like recovery. So already in 64, we have the notion of not only responding, not only giving a very, very short relief, but now federal government is more involved, or starts to get more involved in recovery, because they realize that those events leave such impact that it really affects the infrastructure of the state. And the infrastructure, as you know, as you're going to study in Homeland Security Studies, is very interconnected, right? So if the infrastructure is interconnected, the federal interests are very heavily involved, you know, for routing and, you know, and so on and so forth. So suddenly you start seeing those major federal agencies getting involved in support to local jurisdiction, you know, after the Alaska earthquake, to make sure that they can bring them up to functioning, some sort of faster functioning, and a larger scope than just your regular short, very small Federal Relief Fund. With Betsy, it was a little bit more expanded, and as Todd discussed, and you all touched on it, it was more of a President Johnson was actually extremely visible to oversee the federal workers, assisting. And so this presidential involvement was sort of really, really important because it sort of gave more credibility for the federal government being there, and also helped oversee all those resources that were being utilized, and also make assessments so more money can be designated to this event. And so you have this recovery, reconstruction, expanding of the Disaster Relief Act, and you actually captured all those different things that happened. So the loans were much lower, and forgiveness loans and lower interest rates. Colleges and universities were now included in that reconstruction process, that they can have some of that loan forgiveness as well, or be part of it program. And of course, and you mentioned that towards the end as well, a very important thing was in 1968, the creation of the National Flood Insurance. So the National Flood Insurance protection was huge. It was monumental, because now in those risk-prone areas where the insurance wouldn't insure, where the insurance would not cover, the federal government will say that they, with some strings attached, of course, for mitigation planning, for preparedness and all that, but they will come in and they will subsidize, the housing for those areas that are uninsurable under certain conditions. So the flood insurance, of course, it's much cheaper, it's subsidized and all that. It was a huge step. And that was the aftermath of Betsy as well. And you had a very good discussion on that. Todd touched a little bit on technologies in those days. And you talked about Johnson, who took it upon himself to be part of the scene and management of the scene. And again, the subsidies to high-risk prone areas, definitely if you have a president that is involved, some policy is much easier to implement later on. So with that, so the very good discussion on that, and then you moved into Carter administration and sort of talked about how during Carter administration, all those different focusing events were making people aware that there was a lot of federal agencies by then involved. The acts are getting expanded, more money is allocated, yet there is not a really good federal way of managing it all. On one hand, we had the civil defense and sort of fell out by the wayside by the end of the 70s. The nuclear war didn't materialize. There's a little bit more of a relaxation. This is towards the last 10 years of the Cold War era. So it's not, the tensions are not as high as they were even during the maybe Cuban Missile Crisis. This is where we're past that during Carter administration. Carter administration also was this time of very good relationship, or starting a really good relationship of the United States and the world. We had peace treaties in the Middle East, and some really good talks with the Russians. So this defense sort of, moving to the side, and now you're looking at all those different natural things that are happening, and those resources are not sort of reshifted or shifted. So this sort of started during Carter era. I think some of the things you didn't mention, there started getting, there's an emergence of those different organizations like National Governors Association, so the different governors of states sort of have an association, they start talking. And so there's a need to sort of create something federally that's going to manage from the federal standpoint all those things that are happening. So Michaela, you mentioned that, from that civil defense-based fallout, nothing happened. Carter is realizing that something needs to be done with that fragmentation of efforts, and creates in 1979, does the assessment study. I think you mentioned the assessment study. I think Lena or Todd mentioned the study. And then Federal Emergency Management Agency is the first federal entity that sort of takes on that mission of civil protection and defense at a domestic level, not in the times of war, not for any of that, not for enemy attacks, but for everything that has to do with hazards and sort of threats later on, as you will see through Oklahoma City bombing and stuff as the chapter was progressing. So FEMA gets created. Biggest expansion of that emergency management structures happened during his presidency. And so FEMA was entrusted with all those different functions, mostly. You talked about it, about organizing, allocating, managing that federal disaster relief. So FEMA, you have that act or many different acts along the way, expanded all those agencies involved with support and coordination of resources, flood insurance and National Guard use and all that. And now there's one agency that sort of takes that umbrella and manages that federal assistance. Housing, that used to be under HUD for disaster relief, went under FEMA. The civil defense component, again, went under FEMA from DOD, and transportation out of commerce. So FEMA took those functions for that, coordination of domestic emergency management, so to speak. And of course, now, this brings us to the question on the dual approach. What's that dual approach? And certainly, you mentioned that, there became an integration, so to speak, of during FEMA. It's sort of the defense got reshifted towards more civil protection. So from the defense to the civil protection and to FEMA having more of that umbrella. And so the dual use, yeah. And why it's important to know, it's because when we're speaking of that Federal Emergency Management Agency, why was it important? Because this is no longer now that the acts of God are not a business of federal government. So with the creation of FEMA, you have this first element, so to speak, that is institutionalized, where you see that the government is not only in charge of protecting the nation from enemy threats, but the government has a responsibility to look at all those other events that will cause damage. And this is a huge shift in perspective. And very, very progressive, obviously, and very needed. But, the government can no longer abdicate, that the states need to handle it because it's we are based on federalist structures, right? States should govern themselves. The issue of emergency preparedness is becoming a huge federal issue now. So between the acts of God and the acts of man, emergency management during the Carter era and during the creation of FEMA is becoming, is having that dual lens. And we can say now that it is all hazards. And as Todd mentioned, it doesn't really matter what we are preparing for, because ultimately all the functions are going to be identical. What we're going to be needing is, wherever it is an enemy attack or wherever it is a natural event, you still have certain functions. You still need to move people. You still need to feed people. You still need to house people, right? So it makes sense that because a lot of those different functions are going to be similar, we approach it in the same way. Warnings, whether it's a warning about nuclear fallout and you have to go in a bunker, or it's a warning about a tornado approaching, Todd, about that. You still need to communicate with the public. You still need to have some kind of dissemination of information, alerts, using technologies for that. So they started realizing already, in that time that, all hazards could be a good way to go. Now, that's before anybody ever mentioned Homeland Security, right? We have FEMA and we have Federal Emergency Management Agency. But already then, man-made or natural, you prepare for them, you train. It doesn't matter what you prepare for, you will never ever have the event that you prepare for, but it's the preparing itself that makes you aware of those issues. So, I think that you concluded that the all hazards approach, it sort of evolved from at the federal level, right? Because, we always had natural disasters, but the federal involvement sort of went from nothing to man-made and natural and technological altogether. And so that takes us to the one on, let me see, on the civil defense videos and strategies for making people prepare then and now. And I think that was a very difficult question. It was very long and complex, and I think it was difficult for you to answer it. I think you had no issue with saying, okay, when we had a nuclear threat, it was logical to tell people to, organize bunkers and fallout shelters and have emergency food supplies for in case, there's radiation and stuff like that. Although it's really debatable how much those bunkers would have helped. But, this is not the question for debate here. We certainly have totally different, those threats are not as prominent today. So you all agreed that the videos were good in the days that they were created and the technology was different, the outreach to the public was different, and so on and so forth. Now, as far as make a kit and be prepared, this is a mantra today of emergency management. And so even though I think you agree that in Florence, making a kit is not a very, it couldn't help the family. But perhaps, and you all mentioned that, I think, Michaela, you said you have 2 kids and you think about it and you do everything you can. At least you will have a communication plan with your family, or at least you have identified where you can go to. So it's not necessarily what's in that kit and how useful it is, that bottle of water or what might be in it, but it's a thinking and awareness and actually doing some planning versus not being, prepared at all. So that's one part of it. And I think, you all had a discussion about that. It is not about the kit. It is really about the actions that individuals take to enhance their awareness about those natural disasters or other events that can happen to them. Yeah, in a disaster, I think Lena said that the kid would not do any good, but you have some type of plan, you have a communication plan in place, and so it's more about the process. And I think, Michaela, you mentioned that if you live in places that might be remote or not accessible or so on and so forth, it makes sense to do some type of planning. And certainly, even though not everybody will evacuate, even if they think about it, even if they know that they should because of, all social vulnerability factors, you still increase the ratio. So is this a new, let me see what Todd said here. Todd focuses mostly on evacuation. So, the critical piece here is the decision-making about leaving or not leaving in big events like Florence. And obviously, if you do leave and if you are well-informed, then you're saving the job of first responders. And while maybe some of those first kids, make the kid be prepared, we're not that, useful in Florence, but for you making a tornado kit or having a mattress, having a designated area in a house that's structurally sound, where you can all go, where I don't know if you have kids, but I assume the kids could go, or, the whole family knows exactly where to go on a moment's notice, because tornadoes are these quick onset events. So again, I think your point was it is a process of thinking about it and having something versus not, being totally caught unaware. And not everybody can save money and have it on the side for a hotel, but if they can, that's definitely a plus. And you mentioned transportation, and maybe some kind of a deeper form of make a kid be prepared is to actually, in those large, massive evacuation events that we seem to be having more and more often, and they are not going to go anywhere, is to have some kind of transportation plan, which I think in a country like the United States that is very heavily individual transportation driven, and except for urban areas, public transport is not like in Europe. That is a very difficult proposition for disasters if you don't have that public transportation every day, right? So having that available for vulnerable populations in disaster is difficult, but certainly something to strive towards. And then on the whole final issue of social control, I think what I wanted you to think is whether we created this big area of emergency management where in reality people have always had to prepare and think about those things. And we now say, make a kid be prepared and abdicate the responsibility for households and stuff like that. But I think that what you took from that of a social control, that yes, it's another aspect of management, that the management of the Cold War threat turned into the management of all threats and hazards plus more. And yes, it's in a way of social control, but it also translates into the need for individuals to take their own responsibility for certain actions if given proper information. So this is sort of where I think you ended up with that. I don't think any of you think that emergency management puts too much responsibility on individuals, which is an argument that has been made, that, if you tell people that they need to be prepared for those big events like Florence, well, they can't. It is actually at the mitigation level that we haven't really gotten to, is where the laws need to change about how we build and how we manage weather and how we, consume energy, and all kinds of social issues that are a lot more complex than just responding to incidents and then telling people, well, you didn't evacuate, it's your fault, where in reality that home should have never ever been built in that area. But that's a topic for altogether a different discussion. So thank you very much for your session. It was very comprehensive. I was very happy with it. And I'll see you on your next one. And please involve Justin. As I mentioned, it's really critical that he's part of the conversation as well. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Vivian.